Cool. Well, I guess while we're waiting for people to show up, maybe you wanted to talk a little bit about the session because this will be recorded and kind of what you're hoping to share with people, what you're hoping they can get out of this session.
Right. Yes. So, hi guys. I'm Nick Holloway. I'm the fiction editor here at TCK. This is kind of a look into my day to day as an editor. Basically, we'll be going through opening chapters of a couple submissions here. We had a great amount of submissions, and obviously, we'd love to go through all of them, but we don't really have that time right now. So, basically, I'll be going through these chapters, and you'll kind of see, you know, process. So yeah, we're going to be going through these chapters one by one, and basically going down from the start to the end, and you'll kind of see what it looks like in the editing process. And at the end of it, I'll give certain notes of the chapter overall and areas that I think that the author could really benefit to implement for the second draft. So that's essentially what we'll be learning here. And the goal of this is not to, take your work and to rewrite it in the way that I would do it. It's to keep your work as much as it is as possible. You guys are great writers. So yeah, it's basically augmenting what you guys have already written and making sure that the second draft can be, even better than the first.
Awesome. I love it. So you've gone through thousands of submissions in the past few months, and I'm curious if maybe you want to share just a minute or two, like what are some of the most common things that you would recommend to writers who want to improve their submissions, and especially I suppose with the first chapter, since that's generally where you dive in first.
Yep. So when I go through submissions, the first thing that I look at, and it's not so much the story and how cool the plot points are, it's the writing. So when I am, putting submissions into maybes or even the yes folders, it's based primarily on the writing, the voice of the author. I want to make sure that our authors possess their own voice. And by that, I mean, I don't want to have authors that sound exactly like all the other authors. I want authors that aren't afraid to say, write gonna instead of going to, if it makes sense for that character and the story. I want to be hooked within the first page. I think authors generally, a lot of new authors especially, they make the mistake of dumping a whole lot of backstory on you in the first, either prologue or first chapter. And I would say, just dive right into the protagonist and the conflict that they're facing in the beginning of this book, so that we can really dive right in and move alongside them and really root for them from chapter one. I think tone is a big thing as well. I want to be able to feel what this book is going to offer from the first page. I think a lot of readers, they're not generally looking, well, obviously you're going to be looking for a certain genre that you want to read, and you're going to kind of know what the tone is supposed to be. But I think readers get kind of downhearted when they start reading a book and it's a thriller and it starts out reading like a romance, you know what I mean? So really know your genre, know your tone, and know the types of word choices and ways in which you could hook me if it's a thriller, right? So those are the things that I really look at when I'm looking at submissions. Obviously, there's a lot more that goes into it, but we don't have a whole lot of time. So yeah, I would say in regard to submissions, really make sure that first opening chapter is something that's going to hook me, and it's something that I'm going to want to keep reading and pushing through and rooting for the protagonist in the beginning.
Cool. So let's talk a little bit about the hook part, because maybe you can just share, out of the many submissions you read recently, is there one or two, first page where you really felt hooked, and why? What was it about that made you feel like, oh, I would have to read more?
Yeah. There's a whole lot of really good submissions that I've gone through recently. I would say the one that really got me recently is the one that we actually said yes to, and it's a gothic horror called The Devil's Whispers. And the writing certainly needed a little bit of work in the beginning, but I think what really hooked me and what really got me excited about it was the fact that the author used the epistolary format, which is something that isn't used very frequently nowadays, and that's the collection of journal entries and letters. And rather than it being an actual narrative, it's the story is told through this idea that, you know, this is like a found collection of letters and journal entries. So the author was very daring in trying that format, and you know, it read a whole lot like Dracula and like Frankenstein. And I thought, you know, how cool. Authors, there hasn't really been a whole lot of authors who've been utilizing this format. So I think if the author does it well, which he did, he could really own, you know, this type of genre and this type of format. And you know, he got right into the protagonist's storyline. You know, it starts out with the protagonist going, you know, traveling to this castle to meet with this dying lord of this manor in order to help him with his affairs. And when he gets to that castle, creepy things begin happening, right? So it's not, he didn't begin the story with the whole backstory of this castle or with this lord or with even the main character. It was, you know, we were diving in as Gerard, the protagonist, and traveling, you know, actively traveling, actively having something to do. And, you know, we experience the trials and the tribulations through Gerard rather than, you know, being told all of this massive dump of backstory in the beginning.
Yeah, awesome. So it sounds like it was a couple of things. One was just getting right into the action. That was really important to you. So like you felt like you were already in the action. It wasn't backstory or anything like that. It was just like you're in the story, things are happening right away.
Right.
And then also that he tried kind of a different format. So he was kind of brave in that sense of trying something that wasn't just your standard horror novel.
Correct. Yep.
Awesome. Very cool. Cool. We're about to jump in and have you go through some edits with us live. We can look over your shoulder and see, you know, what you do in your thought process. And I just want to share a couple thoughts with everyone before we get started, because you're probably gonna be really impressed with what you see today with Nick and his thought process. He's a very smart guy, really knows what he's talking about with writing. He's an award-winning author and a great editor. But I want you guys to know, like, anyone can do this, right? So Nick's not a guru. He's not better than you. He's not special. We're all just human beings, right? And we're creative, and all of us are creative. You are creative too. And so we all have good ideas, right? And we also have bad ideas, right? Not all of any of our ideas are good all the time, right? We have lots of ideas, and some are good and some are bad. We have to figure that out as we go. And so today we're just going to be kind of having a discussion and walking through our thought process and sharing some ideas. And you might find some of them good and some of them bad. But I just want you to know that, you know, we're not special or above you in any way, and that you can do this stuff too. And you can learn from what we're doing and learn from this process. And the more you practice this and the more you read and the more you really study writing and practice it, the better you're going to get. And so I just hope that this call today really inspires you guys to dive more into writing and to fall in love with it, to fall in love with storytelling and word choice and all the great stuff that goes into communicating your thoughts and your stories on paper, and also to maybe editing and helping other people, you know, share their thoughts and stories on paper too. So I just want you guys to know that we're not perfect, and you don't have to be perfect either. But if you just give it your best effort and, you know, you surround yourself with other people you can bounce good ideas off of, I think you're going to do really, really well. And so I hope you enjoy our session today, and feel free to post any questions you guys have in chat, and we'll do our best to answer all the questions at the end. So Nick, with that, I'd love to just let you dive in. Let's get started.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Let me share my screen here. All right. So like I said, we had a lot of great submissions. Obviously, we can't go through all of them, so I'm just going to dive into a couple that I thought were just, you know, really great writing, but could definitely stand to go through a couple of comments that might make it a little bit better. So let's start in chapter 1 of Scofideo. So the first thing he always sees is red roses lying as if flung like garbage against a bank of white snow. Not red exactly, more a scarlet so bright it hurts, a sparkle in the periphery of his eyesight. It's when he grasps the roses that they run down his hand, soaking his skin with blood. Really cool opening. Obviously, this is, you know, it's been italicized, so it's a dream sequence. But yeah, I really encourage authors to do something like this. If, you know, begin with a visual, begin with something that is going to really hook your reader here. So let's see.
That strikes me as kind of cinematic. Like if you've seen that movie, like American Beauty, it kind of starts with like something like a bed of roses. It's like very visual. You don't know what's happening, but there's this cool visual scene, and then he goes into the story.
Exactly. So I like to, let's see here. I like to separate these by triple italic or triple ellipses. I just think it breaks it up a little bit better. So Reed Ivory jerked upright in his bed. I would make that its own thing. I was trained in screenwriting, and so when I am reading something, everything is very visual. So I think this being on its own really, it sets the scene. This guy is just bolting upright in bed. The nightmare of roses, which had plagued him since the week after Christmas, caused his heart to race painfully. Cold sweat crawled through his hair. That's a little awkward. I don't imagine sweat as crawling. I would say maybe either trickled, or if you wanted to get a little dark with it, you could keep crawling, but I would say something like crawling like spiders through his hair, just to keep with that darkness and that hook. One hand massaged his wrist where the blood of the dream had been absorbed by his waking. The skin looked bruised until he turned on the bedside lamp. He swung his feet over onto the floor into the leather moccasins laid at precisely the right point. Oh, at precise right angles of his bed. Okay, I guess that's fine. As his soles touched the cold animal skin, fear clutched at him, shook him, a tremor running down the length of his body. The fear clutched at him, I would say. A lot of times I see sentences where it's just comma after comma after comma, and I think there are ways that you can, stretch it out to where you don't have to see all these commas. I think visually that's a little bit easier on the eye than seeing all these commas. As his soles touched the cold animal skin, fear clutched at him and shook him, a tremor running down the length of his body. But he had dreamed, a dream, nothing more, a nightmare. Scarlet roses dropped in livid snow. Neither portent nor omen, nothing in it to frighten even a child, except the blood. So this I would probably keep on its own, because I think it's a very sharp sentence on its own. The room was foreign, faintly illuminated, outlines of the familiar, lost in the dead of night. The lack of clutter that as a rule suited him now gave his surroundings the appearance of a no man's land. This reads a little awkward. I'm not really sure. The lack of clutter that as a rule suited him now. I'm not sure if the author is trying to say that, it's his own rule that he keeps his room tidy. And, if that's the case, and that's a personality trait, and I think that's something that we could maybe rewrite in the sense. So let's say the lack of clutter. Let's see.
You could just kind of say like the room looks sparse or abandoned or something like that. He's in the dark, right? So he can't see much anyways, but it's just kind of, it seems like there's not much in the room.
Yeah. I would even just omit this. So the lack of clutter gave his surroundings the appearance of a no man's land. I think it's a little bit easier to understand that sentence there.
Yeah.
Usually comforting in its Spartan lines, now it looked bare, dead. Reed blinked, rubbed the sleep out of his eyes. I would say Reed blinked and rubbed the sleep out of his eyes. He didn't need to turn on the bedside lamp to read the luminous clock's glowing green screen message. So I would give this its own, formatting wise, just to make it stand out, maybe bold it, make it look like that. Yeah. A little bit more true to life to what you would actually see if you're looking at a clock. The minute number shuddered, then clicked down, loud as the cock of a gun hammer. 3:41. And I would say, and then the telephone shrilled. I like using suddenly. Suddenly the telephone shrilled. He sat looking at it for what seemed like a lifetime. Its ringing mocked him. I can keep this up as long as you can. I think that's great. I think that's great writing. It's giving, an inanimate object a very personal kind of thing, which I think is great. At last, he picked it up. It was a bad line. She called him back. At this point, we don't know who she is, so it's a little awkward here. I would say it was a bad line. So he hung up. caller called him back instantly. The voice was still faint as a ghost. It could have been Kate, but it wasn't. He listened to the voice. The woman was calling from North Wales Police. She asked him to confirm his name. Then she explained that his sister had been reported missing. She gave him her telephone number so he could authenticate the call. So here, I think this is great. I think that it's cool that we know who was on the line, but what I would suggest is actually giving all of this, I would turn all of this into dialogue. So that's something that I would write, in the comment to the author. Let's turn this into dialogue.
And what's your thought process behind that?
I think it just it breaks up the narrative a little bit, and I think there's something to be said for having obviously action written out and narrative written out, but I think it needs to be intercut with dialogue as much as possible, so that the reader isn't constantly just going through blocks and blocks of text. I think that readers like seeing a lot of white on the page, and I think it just gives. It's an opportunity to give the protagonist more of a voice at this point. We haven't really heard him speak. So I think this is a great way to show maybe his panic or his understanding of the situation through talking to this person, rather than, this just being in the narrative. She gave him her telephone number so that he could authenticate the call. Afterwards, he called Kate's house in Wales. There was no answer by human or by answering machine. The Hiles phone rang out into eternity. Not sure what Hiles means. I'm sure that's either I'm sure it's something, proper noun. I can keep this up as long as you can. I love that. It's a kind of a return to what we had heard earlier. He hung up again and dialed American Airlines. They were closed. What could he do for 2 hours? There was no way he could get back to sleep now. He tried ringing Kate again, listened to a machine bell he knew no one but him could hear. What was the time in Wales? 8, 9 hours ahead of California? He waited 4 minutes in case she had her key in the lock of her front door and could hear the phone ringing after all. No answer, no dice. He wrapped his robe around his pajamas and shuffled downstairs. In the kitchen, he made a pot of chicory coffee. No cream, 1 sugar. He sat at the breakfast nook, stirring, looking out at a darkness just beginning to bleed sunrise. Very beautifully written. I love that, it's chicory coffee. He has no cream, 1 sugar. It's very specific to him as the character. We get a sense of who he is and what he likes. So I really enjoyed that. And I love, darkness bleeding into sunrise. It really, the author's done well in really establishing the tone here, because we talk about blood. We've talked about blood about 6 times already, but in different formats, right? So there's the actual blood of the roses in the snow. There's, the bleeding sunrise. I think earlier on, there was something about blood in here. So, great job in establishing that tone and, letting us know that this is most likely going to be a thriller, right? He couldn't sit still. He picked up his mug and walked into the hall. Throughout his small pink stucco bungalow lay his only children, a brood of guitars in various stages of construction. Again, going back to his personality and his likes and dislikes, he likes putting guitars together. I think that's a great personality trait, and something that's unique to him. Here a cedar front, there a wenge body, another an old piece constructed in 1959 when he was 18, then abandoned, now to be refurbished for a scholarship student. This is a little awkward because then abandoned, prior to this, you're talking about when he was 18. So it makes it sound as though he was abandoned at that time. So what I would suggest is, another old piece constructed in 1959, when he was 18. Guitar been abandoned. The guitar had been abandoned then, now to be refurbished for a scholarship student, young, gifted, and poor. He unfolded the plan for this latest baby. commissioned by one of Europe's most famous classical guitarists, a genius with a reputation for difficulty, and reportedly even more of a misanthrope than Reed himself. It would be a glorious instrument constructed of approved Brazilian rosewood. I'm not really sure what this means. Maybe it's, yeah, I would have to ask the author what this, so I would, just make a comment. What do you mean by this? Is it necessary? If not, maybe let's omit it. Ivory and ebony with a special rosette to reflect the guitarist's year of birth. The rosette's color scheme was Harry Clark blues. Reed had designed a circle with the holy glow of stained glass. There was still an hour before he could call the airline again. Perhaps best to ready himself just in case he was able to get a flight. And routine always helped in a crisis. He made his bed, then set out his clothes across the smooth, tight expanse of quilt. Each of his movements was economical. He did nothing unnecessary, nothing save that which aided getting him to his sister. So that reads a little awkward, right? So he did nothing unnecessary. Nothing save that which aided getting him to his sister. So I'd probably say he did nothing unnecessary, nothing that hindered the time she could make it safely to his sister. He hung his robe on the back of the door of his bedroom.
There. Could it safely?
Say it again.
Could get safely to his sister, maybe? Oh,
yep. You got it. Good catch. That's why we do proofreading, guys. He hung his robe on the back of the door of his bedroom, stuffed his pajamas into the wicker hamper. Despite the sudden awakening, he still felt groggy. Cold air in the bathroom started the job of waking him fully, a job the shower finished. He stood under tiny He stood under tiny needles of lukewarm water, exquisite pain against his slack skin. As the water did its work, his brain found reason again, the worries, the doubts, night fears brought on by a daft dream. I don't think a colon is necessary here. I would just add another comma. So you have the worries, the doubts, the night fears brought on by a daft dream. Kate would be okay. Her brother would make sure of that. So really good writing here. There was one question that I had, there was still an hour before he could call the airline again. You mentioned earlier that this piece was constructed in 1959 when he was 18. So obviously this particular story is taking place in the 70s. So I would question whether or not, because now you can call the airline 24/7, right? Because there's constantly airplanes in the air. I would just make a comment to the author, make sure this is correct. In the 70s, get airlines closed down. Just to keep with because right now I'm like, well, why can't you just keep calling the airline? Because it's open 24/7. But back in the 70s, obviously I wasn't alive then, so I wouldn't know. So I would just do a little bit more research and make sure that that's actually accurate. But yeah, that's the first one. Tom, did you have any questions about this?
Yeah, so there's quite a few questions from the chat. So let's just go through them. So you were talking about commas before. Maybe we go back to that section where there was a lot of commas. But someone was asking about just Oxford commas. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I was always trained creatively to include the Oxford comma. If it's technical writing, get rid of the Oxford comma. I think, I think that's just a formatting thing that I was always trained on is if it's creative, if it's in a novel format, short story format, go with the Oxford comma. It's a little bit more, it breaks up the narrative a little bit better.
Cool. And then so the sentences with kind of too many commas. So it sounds like you're concerned with just having too many commas in one sentence. Is that it's just kind of like a lot of awkward pauses in the sentence? Is that right?
Yep.
So what could you do instead? Maybe use and or but or make multiple sentences? How would you kind of, generally speaking, if someone had like 6 commas in a sentence and just felt maybe it wasn't flowing quickly enough?
I would break it up. I would break it up into multiple sentences. or even just sharpen smaller sentences. So I try to personally, I try if I see a sentence that goes, 3 or 4 lines, it's probably too large. So I'll find an area where we can even, like, if it's, he did this thing, comma, and then he did this thing. You could just say he did this thing, period. And then he did, not and then, but then just start a new sentence there. So, in all aspects, try to keep your sentences from being too long. And if you go back and you read and you see a lot of commas, and if it reads a little awkward, find a place where you can put a period and then start a new sentence. Especially if they're doing 2 things in one sentence, that could be 2 separate things in two sentences.
Yeah, and it sounds like something that we both appreciate in writing is kind of the varying of sentence length. So I like the sentences like "except the blood," for example, which is real short. It's right, it's a very short sentence, but it kind of keeps it flowing quickly and kind of keeps a nice pace to it, as opposed to just having lots of really long sentences all together.
Right.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So next question is, are you afraid of using so many pronouns? The word "he" is sprinkled all throughout the first page here. And do you have any concerns about that, or what are your thoughts on pronouns?
I don't think so. I think, obviously this is one character in one scene. You introduce him. I mean, it's the first thing that you see is his name, right? So I think if it's just him throughout the length of the scene, you can get away with using just one pronoun, he throughout, maybe occasionally sprinkle his first name in here, just to remind the reader what his name is. Because if you only mention it once here and the rest of it is just he, then you're going to have to go back and be like, wait, what was his name again? So I think if you introduce him here, and then maybe do he through all of this, and obviously this is a break here where we get to see something visually that's a little bit different. So you could even say, here, change this he to read. That way we're reintroduced to him again. If it's multiple characters, I would say, for example, if it's 2 characters and if it's a guy and a girl, obviously it's easy to make out, one's a he and one's a she. If you have 2 guys, obviously you would want to differentiate, who's speaking, who's doing what. And I think that goes with paragraphs too. Like if one person is doing something, keep that paragraph specific to him. So you could start that paragraph with read and continue with he. And then if, Bob wants to cut in and do something within that paragraph also, I would maybe bring it down into a next paragraph and, and give Bob his own paragraph where he's doing his own things also.
That's great. Yeah, so I think it's especially important when there's multiple characters to make sure that every time there's dialogue, like who's saying what. Right. And it's the only other thing I would share with that is like maybe, and I'm not a fiction editor, but maybe what I would do with this was maybe move the dialogue up even higher so that you do get a little bit more action a little bit sooner. That's kind of my personal style, what I like to read, because I enjoy like the dialogue and things happening sooner rather than all the he's for a whole page. Right. So I think there's many different perspectives and there's not one right or wrong way to do it.
Yep.
So which narrative point of view is preferred? I think they all work in different situations, right?
I guess I'm a little confused on that question.
I assume they mean like third person POV, or I assume that's what they mean, but I'm not positive.
Yeah, I mean, what I would suggest is to just pick one and stick with it throughout the entirety of it. So like for me, the first book that I wrote was entirely in third person. Obviously I had a protagonist that it followed him throughout the majority of it, but he was still in third person. So I stuck with that. My second one was entirely in first person. The one I'm writing now is kind of it's a slight combination of the two, where it's a serial killer thriller. But in every chapter that follows the serial killer's perspective, that's all in first person. And then the rest of the narrative is in third person. So that's a style that I've chosen to do. But in knowing that style, I've stuck with that. And it's kind of a rule where if I'm seeing a killing happening through the serial killer, it's going to be in first person, so that you as the reader are kind of in the serial killer's mind with him. And then the rest of the characters are in third person. So I guess the answer would just be, make a rule for yourself and stick with it.
And it also sounds like you're the kind of editor is like, I'm open to epistolary fiction, first person POV, whatever. It's like,
Yeah.
that's not really the determining factor. And
Nope.
sometimes having a different narrative point of view can be really interesting, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I don't choose my submissions based on any or the other. It's again, it's the writing. Like I think if you've chosen to write in first person, make it believable, make it feel as though you are that person. Make me as the reader feel as though I'm reading this and there are specifics, there's a uniqueness to this character, something that I can associate with and something that I'm rooting for, because essentially as the reader, everything is I, we, me. So it's me as the reader. So I want to make sure that I'm loving that character. But yeah, no, for me, I don't care either way, as long as there's a rule behind it.
Cool. So we have a really interesting question. I'm a person of color and I hold a lot of issue with how people describe people with my skin tone. What's your opinion on the connotation of descriptors referring to POC? And the first thing I would say to that is we're two white guys. I don't know if our opinion really matters so much on this. But what I would say personally is like when I'm writing something, my number one concern when I'm writing is how do I think people will react to this, right? Because whatever I'm writing, I'm writing it to share something good with the world, and I want people to um, to either come away with a lesson or be inspired or be entertained or something like that, right? So anytime there's a word with connotation, I want to be really sure I'm careful about that I don't use words with multiple meanings because they can be ambiguous, right? Or that I don't use words I think might offend people if there's another word that's less offensive that I think I can use instead. So that's kind of my perspective on connotation. Is that I think it's really important to understand if there's a word with a negative connotation that you would only use it in situations where you want that negative connotation to be interpreted by the reader, because you can't control how the reader is going to interpret things. And so if you're using a word with a negative connotation, but you're trying to convey a positive expression, then you're setting yourself up to have kind of a bad experience for the reader, or at least not the experience that you intended for. So I think not having ambiguity is really important. But in terms of specifically how should you describe people with different skin colors, I don't know the answer to that. Nick, any thoughts?
I think there's, especially, in today's world, I think we do need to be very careful on how we do that, especially, as a white man writing in a black man's kind of point of view. The book that I'm writing now, one of the main characters is a young black male. And basically the way that I introduced him is that, he's working alongside a white male, but there's no kind of, there's no cultural divide there because it is set in the present time. I think it really depends on the time frame that you're setting your book to. If it is set back in the 50s or 60s, I think there's something to be said about being historically accurate and maybe throwing in some of that tension. But yeah, I think it's hard, and I would recommend that if you're like me, a white male writing for a black male, I would get as much outside perspective as you can. And so for me, I have black neighbors, and so I'm allowing them to read this prior so that I can see that either they're not offended or maybe they have some suggestions how I might do it better. But I think a lot of it goes into researching and doing your best to make it to where every reader is going to enjoy it and every reader is going to find something enjoyable out of it, rather than feeling as though you just a white guy who wrote a black character and then you published it and decided to see what happens, if that makes sense. I mean, that would be my recommendation, is really get as much outside perspective as you can if you're unsure.
Yeah, I think that's great advice for any writer, is that you should try to get as many people to read your book before it's published or even submitted somewhere as possible, to get as many beta readers as possible, just to get feedback from different perspectives, because the more diverse the people that you send your manuscript to, and not just in terms of, race or gender or things like that, but just like different life experiences and ages and, perspectives, right? We all have different perspectives. So getting different perspectives on your writing can really help you see things that you're just blind to yourself. And that can be really, really helpful for any writer in any field.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So wow, this is going pretty fast. Let's go on to the next one because I know you got a
Okay,
lot more to share.
sounds good. All right, the second one, love the title. Can you guys see my screen? Actually, here, let me just share real quick. Share screen. Here we go. All right. So this one is called A Grand and Noble Undertaking. It begins, pancreatic cancer. Well, damn. I didn't even know what the pancreas did. Liver and kidneys were easy enough to figure out, but I didn't even know where the damn thing was. So right off the bat, I love this because there's such voice and personality to this main character, right? We're in the first person at this point, and it's, this character is like, he's a badass because he's like, we start with pancreatic cancer. That's the hook, right? Well, damn. I would probably give that its own line just to begin the story that way. I didn't even know what the pancreas did. Liver and kidneys were easy enough to figure out, but I didn't even know where the damn thing was. I would maybe say, I'm not even on review right here. Let's see, track changes. Okay. I would refer back to the pancreas because we have talked about liver and kidneys, and just to make sure that we're not confusing people. Looking around my tiny apartment past the American flag pinned to the wood paneling and hanging limp in the still air, my eyes went to the old black and white of my wedding picture. My Maggie would know, having served as a nurse in England during the war and then back here at St. Mary's until she retired. She had helped me and a few of the fellows from my platoon deal. So there's a lot of wordplay going on here. She had helped me and a few of I guess that's fine. And a few of the fellows from my platoon deal with what we had encountered at Dachau. Although the smells and visions would stay with me forever, she taught me how to live with them. She would rock me, her arms around my sobbing frame as I struggled to make sense of what could ever possess people. So that's odd sounding. Sobbing as I struggled to make sense of what could ever possess people to treat others like that. As I struggled to make sense of how so badly, kind of makes it a little bit easier to understand what you're saying there. I wish she was here to hold me now. God, I miss her. Even 15 years later, not a day goes by that I wish it was me rather than her that died that horrible day. I would say, I think it's kind of implied that she died. So I would say, even 15 years later, not a day goes by that I wish it was me that died that horrible day. Because then it's kind of inferring that, okay, well, she died. But a 62 Dodge running a red light at over 40 miles an hour took any choice away from me. I'll admit I'm scared.
I want to go back for a second to the sentence you edited, how humans could treat each other so badly. So I actually liked the way it was written before, and like I got it immediately, and it was really touching to me. And yours is definitely, I agree, more clear. And so that's a really good example of why having like beta readers of different people read your stuff, because there are sentences like that where, and maybe even in a different time and different perspective, you might read it, Nick, and like totally get it immediately.
Right.
But it is a little bit of an awkward way to write. And so generally speaking, I recommend people try to write as clearly as possible so that people don't misunderstand you, because using more complicated language and use more simple language will sometimes create that result for readers where they just don't get it. And sometimes they'll just, they'll close the book, or they'll get bored because you have to reread your sentences over and over to understand it.
Yeah. Cool. I'll admit that I'm scared, but when the doctor made his diagnosis clear, I felt that familiar coldness in my chest drop to my balls. That's a hilarious line. Being 92 years old, it had been a long while since I felt anything down there. I mean, what in the hell am I scared of? It's not like I'm going to live much longer anyway. Something would definitely help me check out eventually. So again, we're in this beautiful kind of internal monologue, and we're getting a sense of who this person is. Obviously, we know that he has pancreatic cancer. We know that he's really unsure of what it is, but at the same time, it's like, well, how does he feel about it? And he's like, I'm an old man. Like, I could care less at this point because I'm going to be with my wife soon. And, So it's giving more of that character and that personality to this protagonist, which I really enjoyed. I pushed the button on my automatic lift chair, which my kids bought a couple of years back. God bless them. They might not visit as much as I'd like. I would say as much as I'd like, but they still. So up until this point, we are in kind of present tense. It's I'll admit I'm scared. It's the lift chair that my kids bought a couple years back. God bless them. They might not visit as much as I'd like, but they still take care of their old man. So, just make sure that you're keeping with the whether it's if you're choosing to write in the present, then keep to the present as much as possible. If they hadn't gifted it to me, I'm sure they would have found me dead in my old chair. Between my knees and the loss of my strength and the loss of, there's a lot of my's going on here, my knees, my strength, my arms. So you could do well to just omit this one here. So between my knees and the loss of strength in my arms, I probably would have starved right then and there. I don't know. I kind of like the idea of then and there. Nice little wordplay. I shoveled across the room towards the table where another gift from the kids lay. I made sure I took small steps and had a firm grip on my walker, just like the nurse at the VA medical center taught me, so I wouldn't trip and go ass over tea kettle. I love that. So again, the author's done well in kind of implementing small little bits of backstory without, dumping on us that, going all the way back into his history and telling us all about, his time in the war and how he went to the VA medical clinic. They're doing well in taking little snippets of this guy's character and his history and plugging it into the narrative. And that's the kind of writing that I like to see and what I would probably choose rather than, having a prologue where you're talking, you tell us all about this character prior and then you move into the story. I think that's a little bit of cheating. I like just diving right in and just having those little nuggets in there that kind of showcase who this person actually is. It's a little bit more believable. Might bust a leg or my neck like the hollow bones of a robin. Exchanging the walker for the kitchen chair, I ran a hand over my liver-spotted skull and pushed the strands of the pullover back in place. I dragged my tablet towards me. When the kids bought it, I thought they were nuts. What did I know about such fancy gizmos? But I admit, after they showed me how I could move around on it, it was fun. I would say it became fun. I could travel the world right from the comfort of my own home. I streamed all the old dusters and war movies rather than watch that crazy superhero crap or reality bullshit that's on every channel. They want to see real heroes. They should have been with me when we stormed the beaches of Omaha while the Nazis threw everything they had at us. Explosions were so intense, most of us couldn't hear for hours after the attack. Bodies were everywhere, brothers, childhood friends, and buddies from small towns you never heard of. Once the tablet was powered up, I pulled up my browser and typed pancreatic cancer into the search box. In seconds, I had over 540,000 hits. Who the hell puts all that on the internet? I hit the image button and clicked on a picture that gave me a peek where the sucker hid, right up against the small intestines. This author likes using semicolons. I would say be wary of semicolons. Just a general rule, whatever you're writing, a lot of people misplace them and they'll use them in place of commas where commas will work just fine. I read a summary of the cancer and understood where the pain in my stomach and back had come from. It's a little weird, so I would just say, and my back. Where the pain in my stomach and my back had come from. Looking at the wrinkled skin of my arm, I had to admit, again, I think a comma would work here just fine. Looking at the wrinkled skin of my arm, I had to admit it was a shade of sickly yellow. I would say a sickly shade of yellow. I like using alliteration when I can, not over the top, but I think readers enjoy alliteration. It kind of just adds that extra little oomph to the sentence.
It feels a little more poetic.
Say that again.
It feels a little more poetic. It's like interesting.
Right. I'm sure the doctor, some kid that looked like she had just graduated from high school, let alone the medical program at University of Pennsylvania, told me all this. But my mind went south at the words terminal cancer. So again, at the words, I would say at the words terminal cancer. She rambled on for a good 10 minutes while I sat there with my mouth open like some damn idiot. It wasn't until she reached over and shook my arm that I acknowledge her. It wasn't until she reached over and shook my arm, I would say, that I acknowledged her. How long? I remember asking. Because it's so advanced and is spread to both your lymph nodes and her liver. I'm guessing between 6 to 7 months, she said with genuine emotion. I would say here, be careful. Doctors are trained to kind of not show as much emotion as maybe they should. So I would maybe suggest here saying, I would make a comment. I wouldn't necessarily change it right here and there, but I would say, doctors generally are encouraged not to show emotion. So I would even suggest something like, she said, trying to hold back the emotion evident in her misty eyes, or something like that. So you're kind of giving her, she's trying to be professional, but at the same time, maybe this is the first time that she's seen something like this. And so she's having a little bit of trouble holding back her emotions. And I think that gives a little bit more to that character, even as small as that character might be. You're just adding a little bit more humanity to that. Even through my fear, I could see that the announcement affected her as well. No way in hell I could ever do her job. Hell, I went through the battle for Europe and another stint in Korea, but I could never sit there and tell someone they're going to die. Had me a long life, Doc, I said, struggling to stand. She jumped up and helped pull me from my chair, ensuring I had a firm grip on my walker. Lost my wife and a lot of friends along the way. It'll be nice to meet them again. There are treatments that might prolong, she tried to say, but I shook my head, cutting her off. I would say I would say here, whenever you are being interrupted, I'd try to do the M dash instead of ellipses. I think ellipses are more for cliffhangers, or for, if it's dialogue, I would say that it's more for maybe a character asking something, or not really sure how to end their sentence. I would say if you're cutting somebody off, it's a sharp, hyphen, I would say. There are treatments that might prolong, she tried to say, but I shook my head, cutting her off. I don't think so, Doc. I will not pass away with what little inheritance I have from my family, just so I can lose what little hair I have left and shit liquid for a couple days at a time to gain a few hours. It's kind of a long sentence here. I will not piss away what little inheritance I have from my family, just so I can lose what little hair I have left and shit liquid for a couple days. I think you could just end it there. Glancing at her, I shook my head. Not worth it. Here's a prescription for pain. You will need it as this progresses. I looked her in the eye and could see that she was being bluntly honest. I took the paper, folded it, and slipped it into my wallet. Dropping it into my back pocket, I nodded to her and shuffled for the door. She met me there to open it for me. As I walked down the hall, I could feel her eyes on me the entire way. So again, the author's done well in kind of showcasing who this doctor is and her personality. And obviously, she's young and she's trying to do the best that she can at this new job and this new career, but obviously she's still human and she still feels these emotions. So I think the author's done really well here. I looked up from the tablet, scanning the apartment, wondering how I'll break the news to Richard and Gail. So right here, we're kind of, with everything with the doctor, it was kind of, he was looking back on something. So it makes sense that it was in past tense. Now we're back, in the present, as we were in the rest of the chapter prior to this. So I would say, I look up from my tablet and scan the apartment. So we've omitted, a comma here, which is nice. I look up from my tablet and scan the apartment, wondering how I'll break the news to Richard and Gail. Both were retired and enjoying their time off, although Richard was on call for his son Tyler when there were questions about the store. So here it seems as though it should also be in present because, they currently are retired and they're probably enjoying their time off. And Richard is on call for his son Tyler. So, obviously with as the case with the doctor, this has already happened. This is all in past tense. But if this is currently the case, if they're still retired, then I would recommend, both are retired and enjoying their time off. Although Richard is on call for his son Tyler when there are questions about the store. When there are questions about the store. I'm proud that Tyler agreed to continue the family tradition and not sell my old store to one of the bigger companies. He is the third generation to Wilson's Groceries. After returning from my Korean stint, okay, so I would move this into its own thing because we're talking about, we could even move this up into here because we're wondering how I'll break the news to Richard and Gail, and we're still talking about them, so we can keep it within the same paragraph. And then we're going to go into something different here. So after returning from my Korean stint, Maggie made me promise I would stop looking for wars to fight and settle down. Using the money they cashiered from the military with, we purchased a small butchery from an old Italian who was kind enough to teach me the ropes of running a business before retiring. After years of sacrifice and hard work, I was able to expand the business by buying the entire block. Gambling every cent we owned, I raised the older buildings and put up a large building that would house a fully stocked grocery store. As they grew older, both my kids worked in the store, and while Gail followed her mother into nursing, Richard stayed on. And now Tyler carries the name. But now my news would screw up their retirement for close to 6 months. At least when Maggie went, it was fast. Although the pain of her loss almost shattered me, I didn't have to watch her slowly die while she withered in agony. I would spare my kids that pain. I stood and shuffled to her picture. So again, we're back in present tense. So I stand and shuffle to our picture, seeing one other photograph that sits proudly on my wall of me receiving the Bronze Star by none other than Eisenhower himself. I had an idea here because I know that a lot of people call Eisenhower Ike. And so I thought it would be fun if maybe he called him Ike instead of Eisenhower. But at the same time, I'm wondering, if newer readers would even understand that. So I just left it as Eisenhower. Maggie had been so proud, but that turned into a coldness that was biting when she learned why I was awarded the medal. With a young wife and one toddler at home, I had left my relatively safe foxhole and ran 100 yards through enemy fire to not only recapture one of the machine gun positions, but I also ended up killing a Chinese general. Even though we might have been overrun if someone hadn't secured that position, she didn't think it should have been me. She didn't talk to me for a week. Passing the picture, I scoop up our wedding photo, and after sticking it in, okay, so again, there's a lot going on here. So passing the picture, I scoop up our wedding photo. I think you could just end that here. After sticking, after sticking it in the front pouch of the walker, back to my chair in the living room. Settled, I grasp the frame with my knobby arthritic fingers and look at the only woman I have ever loved. Hey kiddo, going to be together again soon. You owe me a couple of dances, I say, as my tired dark blue eyes begin to tear up. Not sure what I should do about the kids, tell them the news or keep it to myself. I don't want either to be sitting here for the next while holding my hand waiting for me to go. That would just extend the pain. I know Gail took care of dying people all the time, but I also know she changed departments in her last years because it was haunting her. Having her watch me die will hurt her all the more. I think technically the amount of dialogue that he's sharing with this photograph right now is okay. I think that it could be done a little bit better. So I love this opening part. Hey kiddo, going to be together again soon. You owe me a couple of dances, I say as my tired dark blue eyes begin to tear up. Not sure what I should do about the kids. tell them the news or keep it to myself. I think we've already made this clear in the earlier narrative that he doesn't want to prolong his children's suffering. So I know that he's speaking to Maggie at this point, but he's already made that point clear to the reader. So it's not necessarily, it's not necessary that this be here. So I would maybe omit that.
Also, to me, it doesn't seem, this paragraph right here, it doesn't seem realistic to me because I'm imagining like being a 92-year-old veteran, right? And like I'm crying looking at this photo of my dead wife, right? And like I can imagine him saying one or two or three sentences and crying, but I can't imagine, someone of that generation going through that kind of trauma, the typical person I've met in that kind of situation. I can't imagine them saying so much, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
So it just doesn't seem as realistic to me to that character. And I'm not saying it's not possible, but I was just something that I would consider there of maybe just having a few short sentences to really get the emotions across, but not all that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, if it was me, I would end it after you owe me a couple of dances. I think that's cute. And I think that's a great way to end it. And then maybe turn this bit into, narrative rather than dialogue. So, something like, I'm not sure what I should tell the kids, tell them the news or keep it to myself. That would just extend the pain. And then it would make sense here that, he wouldn't necessarily say, speak out to a photograph. Like, I know Gail took care of dying. Sorry guys, that's my dog and somebody just rang the doorbell. Harvey, hush. So going back to this, I would probably end it just here and maybe keep this. If you wanted to keep all this, make it part of the narrative rather than dialogue, just for that believability that, like Tom was saying, a 92-year-old man wouldn't necessarily be sitting here talking to his, photograph for that long. Or you can even just omit all this. That would just extend the pain. I know Gail took care of dying people all the time, but I also know she changed departments in her last years because it haunted her. Having her watch me die will hurt her all the more. So again, it works, I think, better as the narrative. So here we go. I trace my fingers across that incredible smile and down her dark flowing hair, my heart aching. Thanks, sweetheart, I said, lifting her image to my lips. The glass was cold on my flesh. I'll spare them the pain. So I was a little confused here because if you're going to say thanks, sweetheart, I would maybe have him imagine her saying something back to him. So maybe add a comment here like, oh no. Or something to that effect. So it's kind of this nice little image of, it's not just him speaking to her, it's him imagining her speaking back to him. And then you can end on thanks, sweetheart. And then he kisses the lips. I'll spare them the pain. And my final kind of comment for this was, this doesn't feel to me like the end of a chapter. Maybe it feels like the end of a portion of a chapter. If you wanted to end the chapter here, I would maybe, give him one final thing to do. So something like, I set her picture down. So hell of a day. And then it gives the reader kind of something to look forward to in that next bit. So it's, you're keeping the reader like, okay, well, what's going to happen next? Let's turn the page and find out. So yeah, overall, I think this was a great chapter to work with. There's a lot of fun. And I think the characterization was really, really well done. I loved this protagonist. I'm not rooting for him, not necessarily because he has cancer, but because he just seems like a very likable person, a very likable guy, a very true to life person. The way that he speaks is very real. And, the inner monologue is great. So I'll turn it over to you, Tom.
Yeah, that's a great job. So we got quite a few more questions coming. So someone asked about, is submitted a manuscript to us with multiple points of view in the format. And I think we already kind of talked about that, different points of view are totally fine. That's not going to be the reason that we would reject a manuscript, right? Yeah. And someone's saying this is amazing. I'd love to get Nick's edits on my chapter. So maybe we can do more videos like this in the future and provide that for you. Who are your author inspirations?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Oh gosh. There's a lot. My favorite author of all time is Carlos Ruiz Zafón. He's a Spanish author who wrote The Shadow of the Wind. Unfortunately, he died last year because of cancer. I didn't realize that until a couple of weeks ago, so I was kind of heartbroken. But yeah, he's a fantastic author. I would say recently I've been reading a lot of Ruth Ware. She is amazing when it comes to writing commercial fiction. So I would recommend, if you guys are looking to write, especially in the thriller suspense genres, and if you're looking for a writer who, she focuses primarily on one character the entire time, and for the most part, it's always in first person. She's incredible at keeping you on the line. I always recommend to authors to, like I mentioned, hook your reader within the first page. Ruth Ware is dynamite at that. I just finished reading The Woman in Cabin 10, and the first page is basically a visual of a woman sinking to the bottom of the ocean, and you're kind of left wondering like what the heck happened, and then it kind of goes back into what led up to that. So yeah, Carlos Ruiz Zafón, Ruth Ware. I love Stephen King. Who doesn't? I think I love Stephen King because he just doesn't really, pardon my language, but he doesn't really give a shit about following the rules. He writes how he wants to write. Dolores Claiborne doesn't even have chapters. It's like one long, just manuscript, it's just Dolores Claiborne's thoughts the entire way through. And it's really interesting. When I first read it, I was like, oh my gosh, how am I going to get through this? Because I like breaking up my day with chapters and stuff, but it was simple enough to kind of to stick along with it. So, Stephen King is one of those writers that I mentioned earlier that, he'll say gonna instead of going to, or he'll say, he'll cuss, and he's just not afraid to do anything. So I'd recommend, for those authors that really try to keep to the book, or try to, keep with the rules that they maybe learned about in English 101, read some Stephen King, and, recognize that it's okay to break the rules. And, he's like the most successful author of all time. And that just showcases that, readers want to read, really believable things. And I think in breaking those rules, it makes it even more believable to the reader. So.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. That's great. That's a great lesson that, don't think that it has to be perfect, right? And don't think that you can't do something just because someone else said you couldn't. You can always experiment, try new things.
Yeah.
And even don't follow Nick's advice. Like if you don't agree with it, if you're like, I want to do something else, like go for it. Ultimately it's up to you as a writer to decide what you want to do. And that's kind of the way we approach editing too. Is like we give you, all this feedback and ideas and comments and even suggestions, maybe rewrite this chapter, things like that. And what I recommend to people is always be open-minded. Anytime you get a bad review or feedback or something to change, always be open-minded. But at the end of the day, after you've taken those different perspectives and after you brainstorm different ideas, it's up to you to make those decisions of how you want to write, what kind of stuff you want to write. So as long as you're open to other perspectives and you're humble, I think you're going to start making better and better decisions the more and more you practice and the more you do it.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that's a great point. Just be open to other people's suggestions. Obviously this is your baby and this is the thing that you spent all your time on, but you're a little bit biased on your own child. And the way that I describe it to my authors is that as your editor, I am not here to take your child. I'm not here to make your child mine. I'm basically the guy that you take to your child to the mall to have them take their picture, right? I'm making your child look good so that, you can take home and be proud of them, if that makes sense. That's kind of the analogy that I tell my authors is I'm here to help you. So.
That's great. I love it. Someone asked, should we use British spelling or American spelling? And it doesn't matter. I think just use whatever you're comfortable with. And, depending on your publisher, when you decide to publish a book, they may or may not make changes to that. But whatever you're comfortable with, just go with that. It's not a big deal.
Yep.
Again, we have another question about just, starting so many paragraphs with the word he. And I think we talked about that already. So it's maybe summarizing the advice there is that maybe at least once every page, if it's just one character on that page, to kind of restate the character's name so we can follow along with what their name is and remember their name easier.
Right.
And then if there are multiple characters, just making sure like there's two men or two women instead of saying he and she all the time, using the actual name so that you know exactly who's saying what or who's doing which action. So as long as the reader knows who's doing the action and I think it's going to be okay. There's not much of a better choice than using the word he over and over again, because you need, using their name over and over again would also be probably even more annoying than using the pronoun. So
right, exactly.
Just keep that in mind.
And just to piggyback on that, I think when you're writing dialogue and you have two characters, I think it's okay that, you don't have to say, Ron said, Hermione said, Ron said, Hermione said, like each time. You could, if it's one bout of dialogue, you really only have to say their names maybe once in the beginning. Ron said this, Hermione said this, and then, continue the dialogue. And, obviously they're going to have their own voices and the way that they speak. Hermione is going to speak a little smarter. So you're going to know who's saying what, as long as you know that there's only two people within that conversation. If there's three people in the conversation, it makes it a little bit trickier. And you would maybe want to include the names more in those kind of situations.
Yeah. And that's great. And that's also one of the reasons why having really strong characters can make your book so much more enjoyable, because when you do have those dialogues and Hermione always speaks with like really, big words and sounds super intelligent, like, it's her dialogue because the words she uses, right? So having strong characters that are different from each other and speak in different ways or have different dialects or something like that can really not just make your characters more enjoyable, but make it easier to follow along what's actually happening in the dialogue and in the novel.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to submissions and what I'm looking at when I'm looking at submissions. And, it could be a really well-written first chapter, and it could be that the plot points are all there. But if the characters all sound the exact same, then I'm going to have an issue with it. I want, everyone in this world is different, completely different. Everyone's like a thumbprint. And so I want you to take that and put that into your characters and make sure each character is distinguishable from the other of the other ones by the way that they speak, by the way that they move, obviously by the way that they look. So just keep that in mind when you're writing characters. Make them as different from each other as possible.
Definitely. Is there a proper way to distinguish between words spoken out loud and thoughts from a character?
I usually, in my own writing, if it's a thought, I usually italicize it. And in doing that, you don't have to say, comma, he thought. It's kind of implied that he's thinking this. And obviously with dialogue, you're going to want to put that in quotes. But if it's written in first person, like this one is, I think you have a little bit more leniency in kind of throwing it actually into the narrative. With the book that I'm writing now, a lot of it is in third person. And so I would say in those third person kind of narratives, maybe, focus on one character within every chapter. That's what I do, is like each chapter I focus primarily on one character. It's their point of view. It's still in third person, but it's their, what they're going through in that chapter. And so in establishing who the kind of subject of that chapter is, you can, italicize thoughts so that you understand, you're in their head, what they're thinking. Here it's a little bit easier because obviously it's one guy and he's the protagonist throughout. So, you can talk about, all of his stuff. He doesn't have this is all happening in his head, right? It's all his memories and stuff, and that makes sense. But yeah, if it's a third person, I would suggest italicizing thoughts and dialogue, just obviously keeping in quotes.
Great. So that's all the questions I see, but there's definitely a lot of people saying, thank you so much, Nick. I really appreciate all your feedback. That was really informative. And it's also some people just expressing like, editors are worth their weight in gold. We might be the storytellers, but editors make us the writers. And there's a lot of appreciation for editors and editing and for you, Nick. And so I also wanted to throw that back at all you writers. Like, we couldn't do what we do without you. So, we feel the same way that we might be editors in a way, right? But without writers, like we wouldn't be anything either. So, it's a mutual relationship. And I think that's what's so fun about the business for me is like finding other creative people that we just love to work with and have so much fun, going through these edits and talking about marketing and that's the concept I love is just that collaboration. And so that's what I recommend to all of you is to find people you can collaborate with. And obviously many of you might be looking for a publisher or an editor, but there's always beta readers, there's other writers you can collaborate with. So I recommend that you reach out. We have a Facebook group for authors. If you're not familiar with that, you can check us out. We can go and connect with other writers and other authors. And I would just say, as much as possible, try to make more connections. I know Nick is a huge fan of going to writers' conferences and events and to meeting people and making those connections. So whatever you can do to get around more creative people like you and build those relationships, I think you're going to learn so much that way, more than you can ever just, sitting by yourself on the computer. It's so important to get out there and make those connections.
Yeah. And with the beauty of Zoom too, I think another great thing is something that I've done recently is, find other writers and put together like a weekly writer circle over Zoom and just, come to each other and either do exercises together, or if you're having trouble, figuring out how to end a certain scene, bring it to that group. That's what, the community is about. We writers are a certain type and it's fun being around other creatives like that. So just really, lean into that.
Absolutely. Well, thanks you so much everyone for being here. Thank you for all your great comments and questions. Really hope you found this session really valuable. And if you did, please send us an email. We would love to hear your feedback on this. What do you like? Maybe anything you didn't like. If you'd like us to do more of these, we are considering doing more of them, but we want to make sure it's really, really valuable for you and that you actually want us to do that. So we'd love to hear your feedback. So please shoot us an email or post a comment with what you learned from this and what you liked about it. And I hope you all have an awesome day. And thank you so much, Nick.
No worries, guys. It was my pleasure.
Have a great day, everyone. Take care.